probably gonna call for backup or something. Yo, let's just like go into the radar.
Back over there. You seriously think they know we're here?
Yeah, definitely. We gotta get over there. Bro, can you carry my bag? Because I put the camera right there.
Yeah.
Come on, put it down, put it down. LSD Rooms.
Holy shit.
Do you want to go to the radar? You run now.
Make one from the radar.
There are many rumors about what happened here, including drug testing on unwitting subjects, due to the presence of a place known as the LSD Room.
The LSD Room was a former World War II base housing. All 4 bedrooms had strange painted designs with the trim and the electric sockets all taped off, everything perfectly professionally done.
The strange designs in this building are highly reminiscent of the colors seen during an LSD trip.
Lysergic diethylamine 25.
Yeah. Oh, look what's in my pocket.
What do you got?
This is from when we filmed the Dark Files, where the LSD house used to be.
This
is the actual piece of the LSD house, the sighting. The
How
asbestos sighting.
How are you sure it's
Because it was in the exact spot that it was in where we were filming.
So
I
it's
was showing
proof
them where
positive that it's the LSD
Yeah, it's
piece.
definitely right where it was.
That's a trip.
That's the last piece.
That's
of
a trip. Look at
it. It
its
was in the same
stripe.
coat for some reason.
Here is the colored room. And then I got the black and white room right here.
Okay, interesting. So out of nowhere, after all these years of hearing about acid rooms, Brian just breaks out the pictures and the footage.
The LSD rooms, if you look at them, I have good pictures of them.
Okay, interesting. This is kind of curious. For what reason?
Check out like the ceiling, not a spot of paint, not a spot on the floor.
Right. An odd pattern.
This is a great moment in the whole investigation because here was something that really did surprise me.
But if you look at the light sockets, they're not painted over. The trim is not painted over. It's all taped off, and it's a professional job.
I don't know why the government would do this to any living quarters. It wasn't kids who did this. It's not vandalism. It was too well done.
What was this house called?
On the Air Force map, it's just named Yellow House. It was a barracks, but that's gone, and there's picnic tables there now.
Well, it's certainly not a dorm because they wouldn't have this deliberate painting in every room and just stick people in there to sleep. There's obviously something happening here. You know, on a military base, what is this, a psychedelic party house? Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
We are going to dive into the details of all this in a bit. But first, let's see what Steve Volk, who we showed our pictures to, and he then showed them to 3 major figures in the psychedelic community, and let's see what they had to say about them.
As a journalist, those pictures give me an avenue to approach the people who knew Leary, people who worked with him. What would psychedelics researchers say about those images? Are they psychedelic?
I agree with Zach Leary in the sense that Tim Leary was never at Montauk, and he would never willingly participate in any project like this. However, his methods were definitely borrowed, if anything else. His studies were used, unknowingly, most likely.
Leary worked with MIT on developing this special psychedelic typewriter, actually a typewriter to better record psychedelic trips, so they can get the proper data and study it. So he worked with MIT on this device, and it just so happens MIT also had a not very well known laboratory, so to say, to develop radar parts for the development of SAGE. It's called the Cape Cod system and the experimental SAGE system, but MIT actually had a building and ran the first radars at Montauk Air Force Station, which was actually one of the first 3 Air Force stations on the East Coast. So it's a lot of new stuff and a lot of high technology, a lot of top secret stuff at the time.
Some time for this. While waiting for those results, the investigator Volk spends weeks digging into the allegations about the LSD rooms and potential ties to acid guru Timothy Leary.
Think for yourself. Question authority.
And called a number of psychedelic researchers, some modern ones, David Nutt, Robin Carhart Harris, Ralph Metzner, who's 80 years old, who worked directly with Leary. Metzner said that he didn't see anything particularly psychedelic about the patterns, but Nutt and Carhart Harris said they did.
I love Ralph Metzner. I'm a huge fan. This book I got in 2004, I read cover to cover. One thing I don't understand is how he didn't think that the images were psychedelic, especially the black and white stripes. Tim Leary, who's a friend of his and he worked with him, wears enough black and white stripes and obviously thinks they're psychedelic for Ralph to have noticed, except for maybe, you know, somebody didn't show him that exact picture. If you are familiar with the Montauk Project book series, then you know Preston Nichols is an audiophile and considers the audio aspect to be a prime component in the Montauk Project and mind control, with one book in the series focusing entirely on audio, The Music of Time. But the very first instance of audio mind control that we can find was Jose Silva and the Silva method, aka Silva Mind Control, a method and a series of products. Jose Silva originally worked in the Signal Corps in the Army, and later was an electronics repairman. it was very prevalent for many years, with the CIA later taking heavy interest in this program. It's even rumored that men in black would visit people that were students of Silva mind control, which were said to involve abductions on a regular basis, followed by re-entry into society. All of this predating the Montauk Project. In the late 80s, I became extremely interested in backmasking and started my collection of vinyl cassettes and CDs over the years that contained backwards messages or reverse speech.
So I was near for you. Yeah. Hey, tell your friends about us.
I was so into it, I even made my own special backwards tape. I pre-recorded a bunch of things I wanted to hear backwards, and then took the tape apart and swapped the reels in reverse, and then slowly put it back together very carefully. We call it cassette surgery, or tape surgery. Yeah. And that's why it was so very strange when Long Island Bigfoot Mike spotted this audio reel buried in the mud, in the bushes, off the side of the road at Camp Hero.
Good?
Oh my god!
Hi, Mike.
Yeah, man. You can check out this video if you haven't seen it already to find out more about this reel. About 10 days later, a popular YouTube channel named The Y-Files released this video, and it just so happened to be about backwards speech, reverse speech, backwards messages in audio, and it was pretty fascinating to learn about David Oates. David Oates, the man who dropped his Walkman in the toilet and it played backwards from that moment on, was kind of the pioneer of pointing out, finding, and studying reverse speech. I also learned that something the CIA considers very valuable is about every 30 seconds, our subconscious mind says something backwards, sometimes our true intent, or something we wish we could say out loud but can't. So this actually checks out, and he put on many examples. Everybody from TV in the music industry, politics, NASA, regarding the moon landing, and even infants. A baby is cooing at its mother, and when they turn it backwards, it goes, "Hello." So this checks out, and we seem to talk backwards before we even speak forwards. At least that's the theory. That being said, if we take another look at the reel-to-reel recording, we can actually see that we did hear a few forwards messages that seem to say a certain phrase, whether we agree on that or not. I just wrote what I thought I heard, but you guys may hear something different, but it sounds forwards, and the rest of it is backwards. So it actually checks out about every 30 seconds that one of the messages is forwards.
Wow.
It's a weird kind of music it doesn't sound like even, it sounds decades before these reels. I mean, it sounds very old-fashioned.
Sounds very
like 20s or something. I don't know.
I mean, when I was listening, I mean, it's all in my head, like in our heads, right? We're looking for something different, but I swear I heard it just speak something out of the right ear, and then there's music coming out of the left, but the right ear was like, "Don't drink the water." Is that what I just? I don't know.
The Harvard Psilocybin Project. Psychedelic experiments in psychology were conducted at Harvard University with psilocybin, the active analog in magic mushrooms. The experiments were run by the team of Dr. Timothy Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert, along with Aldous Huxley and Dr. Ralph Metzner. They had not come across LSD yet, and Leary had an aversion to LSD because he felt that it wasn't made by God, nature, the earth, whereas psilocybin mushrooms were grown in nature, but this was a harsh chemical made by man. Timothy Leary saw an article in Life magazine at the time, and it was about the McKenna brothers and their experimentation with psilocybin thanks to Maria Sabina, and how it was basically given them this whole view on the world that they didn't have before, which was what Leary was interested in. He was not interested in something that was man-made because he thought it wasn't natural, so therefore how could it be used in seeking divinity or looking for that oneness experience. The Harvard experiment was conducted from 1961 to 1963, where Harvard then shut it down due to the fact that they were not happy students were being used as subjects in their studies. Dr. Leary and Dr. Alpert were let go. When the Harvard experiment was shut down, Leary still wanted to experiment, so he continued with the Concord prison experiment to prevent recidivism, and the Marsh Chapel experiment, aka the Good Friday experiment, as an experiment in divinity.
How could they use the radar for these experiments if it was operating 24/7? Unlike in the 1970s where you could just waltz into Montauk Air Force Station, the 1960s were ultra-high security, and in early 1962, it fell under the umbrella of NORAD, which is no joke. This would have to be coordinated perfectly if they were to use the radar for anything other than surveillance. Right off the bat, they noticed problems with the radar, and when it got incorporated into the SAGE system in May 1961, they started to notice problems that were never experienced before and had to take the radar offline several times for testing and recalibration. The phenomenon that was first noticed by the very first radar operators in World War II was again experienced in 1961 when the radar began its surveillance for SAGE. In these Freedom of Information documents, there are several mentions of the radar being turned off for specific periods for testing and recalibration. Television sets from miles around would be interrupted every 12 seconds. Local radio broadcasts were interrupted by the radar, and even cars driving on the base. In fact, when people started their ignitions, you could see it on the oscilloscopes in the radar tower. This very specific date was found for 2 weeks in August, where the radar was completely off, and they were running tests to calibrate it, which, in my mind, would involve running the radar through a series of frequencies that it's capable of oscillating through as part of a test to see that everything is working under the guise of starting the radar back up and testing it. ARPA, aka the Advanced Research Projects Agency, now DARPA, had rolled out brand new tech at Montauk on more than one occasion, including the very beginnings of the internet and computer code. On their timeline of achievements, which is found on their government website, they list Project Agile in 1961, which covers psychological warfare. This lines right up with our window of opportunity for these tests at Montauk. Other than these details, not much else is known, which is to be expected when dealing with this kind of information. Nevertheless, an important piece of this puzzle.
What I will be talking about is something called the Frey effect, which was created by Alan Frey in his article, Human Auditory System Response to Modulated Electromagnetic Energy. It was published in 1962, though it was written in 1961 in the Applied Journal of Physiology, 17th edition, pages 68 and 69. The Frey effect is important to this documentary because what we're trying to show is that in 1961, the radar was being used in conjunction with LSD, psilocybin, etc., having to do with mind control. Alan Frey is a physiologist, and they are biologists who deal with the normal functions of living organisms and their parts, What Alan Frey was interested in was the intent to bring a new phenomena to the attention of physiologists using extremely low average power densities of electromagnetic energy. The perception of sounds was induced in normal and deaf humans as part of this study. The effect was induced several hundred feet from the antenna the instant the transmitter was turned on, and is a function of carrier frequency and modulation. Attempts were made to match the sounds induced by electromagnetic energy and acoustic energy. But what Frey found was the closest match occurred was when the acoustic amplifier was driven by RF transmitter modulator. And with a power of RF, he was able to induce the perception of carrier frequencies. Now, the sounds of the Frey effect. The RF sound that has been described as being a buzz, clicking, hiss, or knocking, depending on different transmitted parameters, i.e. pulse width and pulse repetition rate. Like that thyrotron you see in Montauk that we've shown in our videos, that's one thing that helps with pulse modulation, for an example. When the subjects heard the sounds, they always heard it as being behind the head. The sound always seemed to come from within or immediately behind the head, no matter how the subject twists or rotates in the RF field. So basically, it didn't matter where you moved your head or anything at all, because it would easily be picked up. The mind could pick it up, no problem. As a significant amount of research has been concerned with the effects of radio frequency energy on organisms. Typically, this has been concerned with determining damage resulting from body temperature increase. This paper, though, only is concerned with the auditory effects. As further restriction, only data from human subjects will be reported, since they can be discussed meaningfully, he says. The long series of studies were performed were to ascertain that we were dealing with a biologically significant phenomena, rather than broadcast from sources such as loose fillings in the teeth, as summarized in another paper. So Alan Frey also wrote a paper on how our fillings can let you hear the radio, which is a fun fact. Since we were dealing with the significant phenomena, he decided to explore effects of a wide range of transmitter parameters to build up a body of knowledge which would allow to generate a hypothesis and determine what experimental controls would be necessary. Another interesting fact from this article that the Frey effect can be blocked. It says, on the other hand, we have obtained other non-auditory effects and have found that the sensitive area for detecting RF sounds is a region over the temporal lobe of the brain. One can shield with a 2-inch piece of fly screen. A portion of the stippled area can completely cut off the RF sound. So, just in case you find that interesting, you actually can block the frequency by using fly screen. So, there's an interesting fact for you. It was not until Michael Hollingshead distributed LSD to all of the figureheads of significant cultural importance during that time. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, you name it. Ironically, Hollingshead worked for the head of MKUltra, Sidney Gottlieb, aka the Poisoner-in-Chief. And Hollingshead was sent to Dr. Weary with the famous mayonnaise jar full of acid, where he remained for some time to observe the process. Some say he was responsible for the entire counterculture of the 60s, something that the government wanted to use to bring war and to use it as a weapon, ended up being a weapon to change the world. So, in a way, I guess, psychedelics have their place in this world. Hollingshead moved to Bolivia and died mysteriously in 1984.
Brian's footage of the acid house, I think, is the road to proof that there was a mind control project at Camp Hero. Some of these patterns are similar to the ones used in the most famous LSD experiments of all time, the Ken Kesey acid test. How else do you explain the deliberate patterns on the walls?
Psychedelic art. Is it possible for there to be psychedelic art in 1961? In order for it to have been possible to build and design the LSD rooms in 1961, then there would have to be a way for the government to find information on psychedelic art, or this whole theory falls apart, because the military would not have the knowledge to create such art without a reference. I mean, can you imagine? We started by looking up general history of psychedelic art, what the masses believe by searching each pattern, tie-dye, paisley, etc., stripes. Wiki says the Grateful Dead posters in San Francisco in 1965 were the likely origin. However, Ken Kesey, who traveled with the Grateful Dead when they were the Warlocks, actually traveled across the country in a magic bus named Further, which was covered in psychedelic art. But where did the bus come from? It came cross-country, from New York possibly, the Millbrook House, actually, where Tim Leary, Ram Dass, and Michael Hollingshead were living. This house was also covered in psychedelic art. What makes this all interesting is that Ken Kesey first sampled LSD when he was in the early trial of MK Ultra through Gottlieb. Hollingshead was also a dual CIA MI6 agent that worked for Gottlieb, who was the head of MK Ultra. But if you trace the art back even further, no pun intended, then you will find that Oscar Janiger is the true pioneer of psychedelic art. Dr. Oscar Janiger was a man who was way ahead of his time. The shame of it was his work was never published, Dr. Timothy Leary said after his death, because his work was gold. From 1954 to 1962, he administered almost 3,000 doses of LSD to some very well-known figures and had people draw over their duration of their LSD trip. Some of the well-known figures that he gave LSD to were Cary Grant, Anais Nin, Jack Nicholson, and Aldous Huxley. He is also the cousin of Allen Ginsberg. So yes, psychedelic art's true value and origin stem from 1955, and Janiger was surrounded by people who would have brought his findings to Gottlieb's attention. But Dr. Janiger was in no way involved in MK Ultra. I want to make that very clear. Only his amazing insight into tapping into artists and what they could do on LSD was all he was interested in. But how he pulls into what happened in 1961 at Camp Hero is that the art. Where did the art come from? Well, the art came from none other than Dr. Oscar Janiger. And how did that art come? Sidney Gottlieb. Everything went through Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was head of MK Ultra and CIA's #1 poisoner. He took the lead on many assassination attempts and assassinations of high-level figures, often using exotic and even bizarre methods of attempts to assassinate, such as an exploding cigar in Fidel Castro's case, as an example. He created many front organizations and had unfettered access to powerful resources. Mainly, he had no supervision and no superior. He even testified in front of the Church Committee in 1975 under Joseph Schneider. At the time, he said he destroyed all records and documents of what he did at his time at the agency. 1961 was the year for psychedelic research in mainstream institutions. So naturally, it being used off mainstream wouldn't be so far-fetched, now would it? This is a major piece to the puzzle, for if the rooms at Montauk were to be there in 1961, the idea had to be considered in academia. Whether or not Leary was aware of it, methodology, standards, research were more likely spied upon by Hollingshead and reported back to Gottlieb. The Frey and Janiger studies would have been easy for him to get his hands on as well, And he would also be aware of the possible availability of military and radar sites across the country for such an experiment. Our best guess on who was responsible for setting up the LSD rooms and possible mind control trials at Montauk was most likely Sidney Gottlieb, who passed away in 1999. Many obituaries spoke of how he would not be missed and how no one knew the true devastation that he had wrought on people during his experiments.
The person in charge of MKUltra, Sidney Gottlieb, who I talked to briefly on the phone once, he told me an interesting thing, which was there was another unit within the CIA in parallel to his conducting mind control research, which has not been identified or declassified at all.
The LSD rooms were part of the very first mind control experiments at Camp Hero, and surely not the last. Whoever ran the 1961 mind control trials at Montauk set the tone on base for the decades ahead.
Wait, what? Why did this cartoonist draw his fellow servicemen as psychedelic mushrooms? Fed shit, kept in dark. This is all too strange.
Brian and Danielle's working theory is that the use of LSD is somehow connected to Camp Hero's huge radar transmitter.
They picked up on where MKUltra left off with some of the LSD experiments, and they did what the people at Harvard wished they could do, is add hallucinogens with oscillating microwave or radio waves. And they had the perfect place at Montauk to do it. And that's when that room had popped up with all that psychedelic designs.
There's really no proper explanation for this outside of the fact that this house was used for drug experiments. Experiments that were not supposed to have happened here. On public record, the government denies anything like that ever happening here. But every room is deliberately painted this special pattern.
You're absolutely right.
So you have to ask, what was it for? Why did it happen? And I think the best speculation I've heard is that, yeah, they were giving people acid. I know the U.S. government has carried out all sorts of unwitting human experimentation involving LSD and other hallucinogens. So I don't find it all that far-fetched to suggest that the experiments we know have happened elsewhere also happened at Camp Hero.
There's a lot of strange things, and the sum total of all those strange things is compelling.